Section 1. Connect your devices. Welcome to this video on setting up your V-Series and P-Series controllers. The first thing to mention is that it is essential that you use the supplied cables in order to connect your devices. If you've used a iCON Pro Audio 1 hub with the previous generation of controllers, you may wish to continue using this. Otherwise, connect directly to your computer using the supplied cables. Section 2. Assigning operating system. The second task we have is to make sure that we allocate the correct operating system for the device. So we turn on the device while we hold down the fourth rotary encoder button. We're given the option of Mac OS or Windows, and we're going to select Windows in this instance by depressing the adjacent rotary encoder knob. Section 3. Assigning controller positions. If you have a single V1-M unit, please note the following. Please note that this does not apply to P1-M units. When you switch on your device, a record button will light up. As default, this is set on channel 1, where it should be. If it is not set on channel 1, you can change this after you switch on your device by pressing the record button on channel 1. When it lights up, you'll have a brief window of time to change it. Owners of single devices can now skip the rest of this section and go directly to the next section, Section 4, Assigning DAWs. For owners of VM1 and P1-M units with P1-X and V1-X extenders, please note the following. The order in which the units are placed, for example, one extender to the left of a main unit or a main unit placed in between two extenders, is determined by the order in which you configure the units in your DAW. However, the DAW needs to be able to identify which unit is which in order to do this. Therefore, we need to assign an identity to each unit. These identities will be known as X1 to X7, so for example X1, X2 or X3, pertaining to positions 1, position 2, position 3. As I'm sure you've already surmised, it's set using the record key of your extender or main unit when it's switched on. Let's begin by using an example of one V1-M unit and one V1-X unit. This would apply to a P1-M and a P1-X as well, although the user would not need to set the record button for the P1-M unit. We're going to set the V1-X unit to the left of the main unit in this example. I'm going to turn on the V1-X and press record on channel 1. This signifies it's going to occupy position 1, or X1. Now I'm going to turn on the main unit, the V1-M. After I turn it on, I'm going to press record on the second channel, signifying that it will now occupy position 2, or X2. Please note that in the lower display, the track numbers now line up, i.e. tracks 1 to 8 for the extender in position 1 and tracks 9 to 16 for the main unit in position 2. Let's have two extenders to the left of the main unit. I'm going to press record on channel 1 on the first extender after powering up so that it occupies position 1, or X1. I'm going to turn on the second extender, the one in the middle, and I'm going to press record on channel 2 so that it occupies position 2, or X2. Similarly, I'm going to turn on the main unit on the right and select record on the third channel so that it occupies the third position, or X3. Please note how the track names now line up. So tracks 1 to 8 are on the first extender, tracks 9 to 16 are on the second extender, and tracks 17 to 24 are on the main unit. So we now have 3 units identified in positions 1, 2, and 3, or X1, X2, and X3. A popular configuration is to have the main unit in the middle, so let's try that. On the first extender on the left, I'll select record on channel 1 to set it as position 1, or X1. On the second unit, the main unit, I'm going to set it as position 2, or X2, so I'll press record on the second channel. The last extender, the one on the right, will be set in position 3, so I will press record on channel 3 on that unit, or X3. I'm going to keep this configuration for a while. Now, whichever configuration you choose, if you set the identities of the controllers as we've just done, the DAW will be able to differentiate one controller from another, which is what we need to do in order to set them up properly in our DAW. So let's do that. Section 4. Assigning DAWs. In order to progress through this section, you will need to download and install the iMap. The iMap is available on the product page of your device. It's an easy install, so it should not take long. The iMap is where you can make changes to your device, update firmware, and it also helps the extender and main unit communicate with each other and the DAW. You'll need to keep the iMap running in the background when you're using your devices and your DAW. Something to note is that you can change the main device iMap to the extender you wish to update by using the drop-down box. It's also important to know that when you do come to update firmware, that the firmware version is different from the iMap version, as they are both completely different entities. Think of the iMap as the vessel which delivers firmware, it's not the firmware itself. But we'll cover firmware updates in another video. And now to the business of assigning DAWs. We can change the DAW that we're going to use by selecting buttons 1 to 3 in the iMap. Here, you can see that I've already chosen Cubase for DAW button number 1, which you can see on your main controller. For button number 2, I'm going to select Ableton Live. So, I select the button in the iMap and choose Ableton Live from the drop-down menu on the right. And it really is as simple as that. You don't need to do this for the extenders as well, as this will be communicated to them via the iMap. I would advise that you save your file so you can easily record it, and you can also set your iMap settings as your default. We can see in the General Settings tab how the MIDI messages are sent to the controller. You can also see how the touchscreens are laid out. You can play around with these and set them to your own specifications. Changes are immediate and you can reset to default at any time by right-clicking in the main window. We can select any one of the 18 supported DAWs listed in the drop-down menu for the third button. Equally, if we had a mastering setup in Cubase and a general mixing setup in the same DAW, we could select Cubase for 2 or even 3 buttons. The same for every one of the 18 supported DAWs. So now it's time to configure our 2 DAWs that we've set for buttons 1 and 2, Cubase and Ableton. Section 5. Configuring the DAWs. Before we start, let's remember this diagram from the manual. It gives a general overview of how the DAW choices are configured. And remember, you have DAWs 1 to 3. The DAW I've set for DAW button 1, in this case Cubase, will be configured as the first MIDI input, as we can see here. MIDI in 2 is for DAW button 2, which we've set to Ableton Live. MIDI in 3 is for whichever DAW you've chosen for DAW button 3. MIDI in 4 should never be selected within your DAW because that's what the iMap uses to communicate with the devices. As Cubase is our DAW number 1 or DAW number 1, let's look at that first. In Studio Setup, we're going to allocate an instance of Mackie Control. The way in which Cubase works is from right to left, so we're going to allocate the third controller, the one in position 3 or X3. This is the extender to the right in our current configuration of 2 extenders either side of the main controller, which we'll now set as our first instance of Mackie Control number 1. Looking at the list of possible units, we know that we're looking for the extender that's set in the third position, i.e. X3. And is MIDI in 1, i.e. the first of 4 possible selections, DAW button 1. So it has to be this one. This choice has the device listed as V1-X 3, and it's the first MIDI in. I'll now choose the exact same output. I know I'm looking for the controller, the extender controller, in the X3 position, and the first in a cluster of 4 possible choices, MIDI in 1. So this is the one, V1-X3. For the P1-X, it would obviously be P1-X3. So that's my first unit selected. Now to add a further instance of Mackie Control in Cubase. This will be the middle unit, and of course that's the main VM1 unit. In this case, we're not actually looking for an X number. The main units are always just seen as main units within the DAW. When you set the position in the initial setup using the record button, you are primarily setting the order of the tracks in the lower display for the main unit. In the extender's case, it does set the identity, however. So here we are. I can see the main unit, it's DAW number 1, so I know it correlates to MIDI in 1, so I'll add that to my MIDI in and out for Mackie Control 2. Now for the final controller. This is the last instance of Mackie Control we're going to add in Cubase, Mackie Control 3. It's the last one working from right to left in Cubase, so I know it will be the first controller I added when I allocated controller positions, i.e. position 1, X1. So now I know that I'm looking for the extender with X1 in the title and first in the list in a cluster of 4 MIDI ins, i.e. MIDI in 1. And here it is, V1-X1. For a P1-X extender, obviously, this would be P1-X1. So I'll add this as my MIDI in and my MIDI out for our instance of Mackie Control 3. Before we go to Ableton Live, just a quick word about Cubase. It's probably best to use Cubase in compatibility mode. Go to Studio, More Options, and each instance of Mackie Control. You can see here that there are 3, as we've just added. Now, click on Compatibility for all 3 instances of Mackie Control. Additionally, this goes for pretty much all DAWs, but all unused instances of Mackie Control should be deleted. Now, let's march on to Ableton Live. Let's navigate to Options, Preferences, and go to the link Tempo MIDI tab. We're sticking with our configuration of a main unit in between 2 extenders, and since we know that will be the case, we can start by adding 2 Mackie XT instances either side of the main unit. Some DAWs, but not all DAWs, use the term Mackie XT to denote extenders. Now, if you remember, we've added Ableton Live as our second DAW, i.e. DAW button 2. So the instances where we are configuring the DAW will be in MIDI in 2, or port 2 as Ableton Live terms it. It's exactly the same thing. So MIDI in 1 is port 1, MIDI in 2 is port 2, MIDI in 3 is port 3, MIDI in 4 is port 4. And as we know, we never use port 4 or MIDI in 4. As Ableton works from top to bottom, the top being the controller on the left-hand side, we know that this is going to be straightforward. We're adding the units in the order that they were first arranged using the record buttons, i.e. X1, X2, X3, and we're going to be looking for port 2, or MIDI in 2 in old money. And I found the first extender very quickly. Here it is, V1-X1 on port 2. So we'll add that for our first instance of Mackie XT for the input and output. Now for the main unit, as a Mackie Control instance in the middle of the 2 extenders. And here we are, easily finding the V1-M on port 2. No need to look for an X number because it isn't an extender and will always be seen as an independent device within the DAW. We'll use this for our input and output. For the last extender, in position 3, i.e. X3, we're looking for port 2, and here it is. We'll use this for our input and output. Okay, we've got just enough time to go over another DAW. Let's mix it up this time, and let's go for a configuration of 2 extenders to the left of the main controller. So what do I need to do now? Correct, I need to set the controller placements, using the record button 1 to 3 after I start up the machines. Now, let's choose a completely new DAW. Let's go for Studio 1 and let's occupy the 3rd button, so that when I'm choosing this DAW in everyday use, I'll use button 3 to select that DAW. Okay, I've rearranged my controllers to reflect our desired configuration. Now I'm going to select button 3 in the IMAP and select Studio 1 from the drop-down menu. And we're done here. Just remember to minimize the IMAP window if you wish to clear your screen. Don't close it. Remember, IMAP has to be open at all times. Okay, so I've opened Studio One and I'm going to add the two extenders first and then the main unit. Now, it doesn't actually matter which order you add the units in this box, because you will arrange them again a little bit later on in your own configuration. But to keep things very clear and simple for us, we'll proceed in this way. Okay, so I'm adding my first extender, which is set as X1, so we know it's going to be in the first position. We know it's a V1-X extender, so we'll ignore the first choice we come to because we know for definite it's not a V1-M. And here we are, the first X1 or V1-X1 we come to. But which of this cluster of 4 MIDI ins should we choose? We've allocated button 3 for Studio One, so of course it's going to be MIDI in 3. We'll choose that for our output as well. So that's our first extender allocated. Now for our second extender, because we're looking at two extenders to the left of the main controller in our new configuration. So we're looking past the V1-M and past the first extender we've already allocated, and here we are, the extender in position 2, X2. Obviously this would be P1-X2 if it were a P1-X extender, but for these examples we're using the V series, so it's V1-X2. Again, it's MIDI in 3 because we're using button 3, so we'll add this as our output as well. Lastly, we will add our main unit, the V1-M, as MIDI in 3 for both input and output. Now we need to place the units. You may think you've done this already, but in Studio One there's a special step you need to make which is particular to this DAW. Click Placement, drag and drop the controllers to your specification. The difficulty here is knowing which extender is which. They do appear in the order that they were added, which is why we took care to add them one by one in the correct order at the beginning, so we didn't get confused later on. We obviously can't go over every DAW here, but the general principles explored here will apply to all DAWs. Connect using the supplied cables. Make sure you assign the controller positions using the record button on each device. Assign your DAWs using the IMAP, i.e. DAW buttons 1 to 3. Keep the IMAP open at all times, and configure the DAW according to the port number or button number you choose. In our example today, we have used Cubase as button number 1, so we've configured the controllers in Cubase as port 1 or MIDI in and out 1. We used Ableton Live for button 2, so we've configured the controllers as port 2 for MIDI in and out in Ableton. We've used button 3 for Studio One, so we've used MIDI in and out 3 for that DAW. You should, of course, never select port 4 because this is how the IMAP communicates to the devices. Section 6. Everyday use. In everyday use, please make sure that you turn the controllers on first, then launch the IMAP and then the DAW or DAWs you intend to use. Please give a moment between each step to ensure each has loaded properly. A couple of tips for ensuring the longevity and enjoyment of your device. A gentle tap of the touchscreen is enough. The faders are robust, but don't rest any objects on them, especially heavy objects. Always read the instructions in the manual. Please remember there are manuals for the P series and V series, and that there are separate manuals for the main unit and the extenders. These will be updated at regular intervals with pertinent information as well as articles in the Help Center. And there will be more videos to follow. I'm Steve for iCON Pro Audio, and I'll see you on the next one. Goodbye.